Welcome to the Working Tools Podcast, where today we will continue our discussion of Chapter 5 of Freemasons for Dummies, how the Freemasons are organized, who does what, and why.
Ladies and gentlemen, brethren all, welcome to the Working Tools Podcast, a casual conversation around Freemasonry. First, it's important to note that our thoughts and opinions are our own and do not reflect those of our Grand Lodge or respective craft or concordant bodies. Please connect with us and ask questions via our website at theworkingtoolspodcast.com.
Today on the Working Tools Podcast, we have our usual group of hosts, Brother Craig Graham from Kalamalka Lodge number 160 in Vernon, British Columbia, Very Worship Brother Stephen Chung from Prince Charles number 153 in Kelowna, British Columbia, David Colbeth from King Solomon Lodge number 60 in Auburn, Washington, and I'm Matt Appel, and I'm a member of Mill Creek Lodge number 243, and we meet here in lovely Montlake Terrace, Washington. So when we left off, I was trying to blow past several pages of the book, and David Colbeth was saying, "Stop the train!" And Craig said, "Trains don't stop that fast." So we were, I guess, David, I will punt to you and say, what about the senior warden, sir?
Thanks. Well, it really spurred when Steve was talking about it. So Steve mentioned in the last episode that he was talking about the officers and who reports to who. In even in our jurisdiction, the junior warden kind of oversees the stewards, or the stewards assist them, and so there's an opportunity for leadership development there. And then he said that the senior warden oversees the deacons, making sure the lodge room. Now, I would agree. We ask or hope that the deacons will set up the lodge room, but it's not necessarily identified that the senior warden is the leader of those two specifically, and no one in our charges or anything that talks about that. And so when I was reading the book, it talks about how, but he's got it in here, so we're not giving any secrets away. There's a column that indicates who's in charge essentially of that moment of the lodge operations. And in a moment in our ritual, the senior warden elevates his column to indicate that he's in charge, essentially. Or what it says is, actually, we've always kind of looked at it as that lodge is open at that point, and that the column is upright. But if you take it one step further, when the junior warden raises his column, he's in charge. And so then I thought, well, wait a minute. If the junior warden's in charge, not to read ahead here, but if the junior warden's in charge when his column's up, then the senior warden must be in charge when his column's up, which is accurate, because I don't know if he talks about it, but at a certain point, we check to make sure they're only Masons in the room, and that there's no eavesdroppers or people that shouldn't be there. And I don't know this talked about, so I'm not sure I should talk about it too much here, but there's a question of who do the deacons report to when they're checking. And often people will say, well, the master. Really, it's the warden, because the warden's the one that told them to check the lodge room. And so they should report to the warden if there's an issue with somebody in the room. And that aligns perfectly with what he's saying here. The senior warden, is actually in charge of the lodge room while lodge is open, even though the master is set the craft to work and give them good and wholesome instructions, right? But the senior warden is the one really in charge. And 16 years, I never really, I guess, thought about it that
way. It's kind of like he's the foreman.
The
workers.
Right. Yeah, I suppose.
The boss is sitting up in his chair there, and he's really the boss, but the foreman has got the task of seeing that the workmen are doing their work, right? And it's interesting. I hear you say about the columns and who's in charge. I never really viewed it as that. We're at labor when the senior warden's column is up, and we're at recess or refreshment when the junior warden's column is up, is all I've ever really paid attention to. So it's an interesting twist on that, to think of it in that other sense.
But it does line up with the ritual, though, and especially David's saying So there's your senior warden in charge while the lodge is active, and then the junior warden, superintend them in the hours thereof, while and ensure that they don't turn refreshment to intemperance and excess, and so that's that. But yeah, that's I got a couple of light bulbs going off there that finally I realized, okay, that this is now those puzzle pieces are fitted together. I've read in a couple of books that I've got that the senior warden is largely in charge of the north column or the north side of the lodge. The junior warden is in charge of the south side of the lodge. I know it's common practice in Australia to refer to the refreshment period after lodge as the South. So there's some association there. And I think that's a bit of a holdover because if you guys remember some research we've probably all done at some point, there's the wardens were both placed in the western end of the lodge at one point, but each of them off to one particular side. That's changed although that I think that still shows up in ritual in some places, particularly jurisdictions, that use the Scottish Rite craft degrees, okay, which are a lot of the Spanish-speaking nations in the world. Maybe you saw that in Cuba, Steve. I'm not certain, but and in that placement, the wardens have sort of responsibility over those geographic areas of the lodge. So there's some history there.
It follows along exactly with most table lodge rituals.
Yep. Or festive board in the English lodge.
Board, sure.
Yeah, works much that way too. And Albert Mackey wrote something that's always stuck in my mind a little bit. The junior warden is sort of in charge of the entered apprentices as they're coming through the lodge. Senior warden, the fellow crafts, and then the worshipful master, the new master masons. He didn't. Mackey wrote all of his stuff about 150 years ago, and a lot has changed since then. But that's something that always that there was some nascent traditional role attached to each of those offices, having to do with members who were of those degrees.
I've never heard that before. That's very interesting.
I'll see if I can find it. It might have been in his Jurisprudence of Freemasonry, one of his miraculously smaller books.
He did a small book?
Yeah, he did. He believe it or not, yeah.
Didn't take 7 volumes.
Yeah, it's just I'll go through it and see if I can find a reference there, and if I do, I'll let you guys know.
It's interesting, like you said, Craig, that it's much more explicit, the junior warden's role and charge during refreshment, whereas the senior warden, if we kind of assume that the column is representative of who's in charge, that doesn't really say that the senior warden, I'll challenge Masons to go back and look at the ritual. It doesn't say that the senior warden's in charge, which is interesting. Why doesn't that happen? And I appreciate the idea that Steve and I agree, this kind of a foreman style. They want to imply that the master's still in charge, but the ritual could have been worded in a way that still gave control to the master, but put the senior warden in superintendence of the craft during while at labor, right? That's something like that.
Yep.
Yeah, I guess I would push back a little bit on the idea of the senior warden being in charge. I guess he is running parts of the ritual, I would agree with, but I don't know that I think if your average senior warden stood up in the middle and started, coordinating the meeting and asking for volunteers for the golf tournament and trying to plan out when our ladies' night was going to be, that the master would go, "Hey, wait a minute, man. He's not in charge."
I wouldn't. I'd say, go, man, go. Wouldn't that be a change? That's an interesting idea. Now you're planting seeds, Matt. Make the
or slinging manure, one of the other.
Yeah,
But here's something, Matt, because I know you served in the Navy and you served at sea. You have the ship's captain, and then you have in a lot of navies. I think the Commonwealth navies did this as well. You have the XO right below him, and those roles are very defined. And I believe that of course the captain is making sure that it's going in the right direction. But I think the XO is kind of, he's the guy that's coordinating departments and things like that. So, I'm trying to, Freemasonry and the military have a long relationship. So I'm trying to work a bit of an armed forces angle on that one.
I would agree. I think the XO runs.
I was in the army, so
the XO runs the ship, runs the business, and the commander just makes sure that the XO doesn't screw up. Or if he does, he takes over.
That's the captain, as one of my captains once said, he sits around and he thinks lofty thoughts about how things should be, and then the executive officer's job to execute on these ideas of his.
I like that because I know Bill doesn't really, well, he once in a while he listens to the show, so he'll get this. But last night we were talking about that. What the senior warden really doesn't do anything all year. And it's funny, we've tried over the years to have the senior warden a little more active, maybe in charge of the ritual work or in charge of the making sure that they're overseeing kind of all the degree progression, that he's in charge of the mentors, that are in charge of the coaching and some of that stuff, but it's never really stuck. There's never been, so it's kind of like a pass. Like you're like as senior warden in a lot of lodges, you're just waiting. What are you're supposed to be preparing yourself for the East, watching and paying attention and actively involved and all these kind of things. But a lot of guys just coast, just kind of hang out in the West.
Yeah, you see that a lot, but they are there to run the lodge when the worshipful master isn't. So they should already be prepared, right? And so, if they've gone through that progression, as we call it, then they've done all the hard work, and this is their last chance to sit back and observe everything as the worshipful master is running the meetings, so that he can learn by example, hopefully, what he should be doing for next year. And he should be, quietly planning these things in his head. And I guess he gets to practice because in our lodge, he runs the board of general purpose, right?
Yes. I'm sorry.
The worshipful master does not, right? And he can actually call the board of general purpose meeting, not the worshipful master.
So it actually says I'm looking at a copy of our lodge officer's handbook, and it says in there that one of the roles of the senior warden is to mentor the deacons in the standard work, floor work, and degree work. There was something else in here that made me think of what we were just talking about. Work with the master to ensure each new brother is appointed a coach. Submit regular articles. Yeah, so there's a whole list of things in here for the warden to do, which are not in the ritual but are recommended.
Right.
Probably sit around and think, man, it ain't going to be like this when I'm in charge.
Yeah, and I guess you're gonna be installed as junior warden next month, eh?
Yeah. So I got to feed everybody for the next year.
Very cool. Congratulations.
Thank you. Second time around doing it. I made it as far as senior warden in my first Masonic career, and so it's like I said, there's some unfinished business I have to get to, but I'm happy to have the office. It's good. We've got a good slate of officers in our lodge too, so I'm not too concerned about it.
Yeah, you started going through the first time until the guys got the pitchforks and the torches together, and then ran you out of town. And
oh yeah, that's the story I've heard. I just go with career change. That's it saves a lot of explaining.
So I just because Matt was so diligent to pull up his copy, I pulled up our copy of the pocket guide to the lodge officer's duties and the worshipful master. Now it does say, in quote or in brackets, adapt as required to fit your lodge application. Okay, but so here's a list of his: preserve and present the charter of the lodge, engage the brethren of the lodge in the craft, know and uphold the following: the Book of Constitution and Regulations, forms and ceremonies, the bylaws of the lodge, promote the health and welfare of the brethren, promote Masonic education in the lodge, insist on proper Masonic decorum at all times, ensure ritual conforms to the adopted form, and ensure ceremonies are properly performed, ensure balloting is complete and correct, appoint non-elected officers, committees, manage the affairs of the lodge, and so on. Instruct the senior warden to call Board of General Purpose meetings as per the bylaws. Ensure that all Grand Lodge obligations are met in a timely manner, right? Then if you go to the senior wardens, it says, his primary thing is to assist the worshipful master as directed and prepare for your year in the East. Then review and become familiar with the following: the Book of Constitution, regulations, forms, and ceremonies, and then you're now a member of Grand Lodge and ought to attend the annual communication. Know your part in the opening and closing in all 3 degrees. Present the final charge in all 3 degrees when required. Introduce dignitaries, visitors, and participate in the finance committee, and call and chair the Board of General Purposes meetings, right? Then you get to the junior ward. Assist the worshipful master as directed. As his principal officer, you prepare for the year in the West. And talks about the degrees of communications and the stewards, and instruct the stewards and whatnot, right? So we have a whole guide that tells them what they're supposed to do, but we're fairly on target.
I would guess most jurisdictions have something. I would hope most jurisdictions have something like that. I mean, Washington is very verbose that way as well. But it is, like you said, it's a guide. It's just a guide.
Yeah.
They can do ultimately what they want. Master's in charge, and
right.
You just got to do the standard work. That's really the only thing. Follow the code. Yeah. Well, something you brought up earlier, Steve, though, that when the master's absent, then the wardens are in charge of the lodge. Senior warden first, of course, and in his absence, then junior warden's in charge. I think we've talked about it before. One of my arguments was that the master, if he's present, could call up any Mason to open lodge if he's present on that degree. I think, but in Canada, they can't do that. It has to be a warden or a past master, right?
Right.
But if the master's not present, the warden can't call up. I think this is the way I read it. Matt can correct me, please. That if a warden's opening, or if the master's not present, a warden can't call up another Mason to open. They must open, warden, senior or junior. I think that's the way it's kind of implied that. I'd have to remember exactly how it says the installation. I can't recall off the top of my head, but it basically says the master is not there. The warden, with the exception of the warden, or this warden has to do it. I mean, he doesn't say it has to do it, but it's worded in a way that implies that the warden has to open and nobody else really can. Now, if the warden wasn't there, if the 2 wardens weren't there, then you got to get a special dispensation for the Grand Master to open.
Right. Now, in our lodge, usually what happens is if the worshipful master is not going to be there, he asks a past master to sit in his stead, right? And so that the senior warden doesn't actually have to do that. But I have seen it where the senior warden has open lodge from his chair, and because
from the West.
Yep.
That's
nothing's.
Even more freaky.
He cannot go sit in the East. He has not been installed into the chair of King Solomon, so he cannot sit there.
That's interesting. I wonder if we don't even talk about that, man.
Right now, in our work, we pass the word. In that funny Canadian work, they don't. Right, so we just don't pass the word in that instance. It was totally a shocker to me the first time I seen that happen.
You have a different ritual for a senior or junior warden opening?
Oh yeah, no. He's still not a different ritual, but there's the one part that you can't do, which is pass the word. Right? You can't do it. in this sense, right? Because the worshipful master, there's nobody sitting in the east, right?
Interesting.
Yeah, it totally blew my mind. So how's this going to work, right? And I just sat there and watched it, and it was like, okay, well, he just went through the verbiage and he did it, right? Right from his chair. It was like, okay,
That's pretty
interesting.
wild. Yeah, that's not how we do it. I'll phrase it that way.
That's not how they did it in my.
Yeah, no, because there's usually a big shuffle where you got to get the senior warden goes over to the master's chair, and the junior warden goes to the senior warden's chair, and then we got to find someone to fill in the junior warden's chair, and there's a whole
Yeah, but your senior warden can never sit in the chair of King Solomon until he's been properly installed into it. Now, I guess he could go to the east and sit in another chair, but he may as well sit in his own comfy big chair where he's at.
All right. So I kind of feel like we've covered the master and the wardens and the deacons to maybe a lesser degree. Does anyone have more thoughts on those positions?
One last question on junior warden. He's in charge of refreshment. Does your jurisdiction allow alcohol in the lodge room?
Yes, in the lodge room.
Not in the lodge room. Not in the lodge room. In the festive board, yes. Right.
Yeah, we're allowed to have it in the building, just not in the lodge room itself.
That's right.
Now you could ask if, for instance, a lodge met in the shrine building, and for instance, the room that they met in was temporarily used as a lodge room and then disassembled at the end of the meeting. When exactly does that cease to be a lodge room, and that refreshment could be had in that same chamber?
When lodge is open.
Right. Great lights.
When lodge is closed, it's no longer a lodge room.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's like when we in traditionally in our jurisdiction, when you install a new master, there's a toast to the worshipful master, right? And we actually put the lodge at refreshment for the time it takes to do that, and then the toasts are carried in on a tray and then carried out. But
but I would even say we've talked on the show and thoughts about having opening lodge in our dining room rather than in the ceremony room, as we would call it. And I think even if you were, if you went to refreshment and had your supper in the middle of refreshment and still had discussion or something, that you could have alcohol if you wanted, if the permitted, whatever, as long as the glasses were empty and the bottles were secure, and you go back onto labor. I think, in my opinion, that would still be okay, even if the bottle is sitting on the table, as long as somebody's not opening it and consuming or have the opportunity to consume alcohol during lodge.
Well, that poses the question with respect to table lodges then.
Well, they're in our jurisdiction, they're a recommended work. They're not standard.
We actually run a tiled meeting.
Yeah.
For our table lodge.
Yeah. There are versions of ours that essentially are titles as well, but it's not a codified standard work. It's a recommended, approved by our body.
It counts as a regular meeting.
Yours does?
Yep. When we have a table lodge, it count. We move our regular meeting to the Saturday or whatever we're doing it on.
Okay.
But it's a regular meeting. The volume of sacred law is open, and we are toasting and charge your glasses. Right?
And then if it seems to me that if your code says no alcohol in lodge, that's a direct violation. It would seem.
Well, I don't know that there's actually any written rule with respect to it.
Ours
is
clear.
Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'd have to look into that, but
Matt's a good secretary. He's quoting in the chat.
Right. I don't know, Craig. Have you reviewed any of that? Have you seen that in our Constitution regulations?
I can't remember.
Yeah, I don't recall ever seeing that in our Constitution regulations.
Yeah, I can't. Ours is even. I don't even think we can call it as a special meeting.
Mhm.
I don't think you can log it as a lodge meeting because then it would be in violation of the code. I remember asking the Grand Master in the very beginning, we were having table lodges, and I went back and forth whether I should get dispensation or not. And I finally did, like the second or third year. And the Grand Master replied graciously, "Thank you for the opportunity. However, these are not codified sanctioned events, and you don't need dispensation.
Mhm.
I can't grant you dispensation." And I think it also could have stemmed from two things. One, it's not a standard work, and two, it would be in direct violation of our code if he allowed it,
Interesting.
because it would then be an official Masonic meeting and not just something for fun. It's essentially, I would say, a secure place for instruction.
Okay.
That's kind of how I would label it under our code.
See if I can find that.
I was going to ask a question generally. In Washington State, was there a long tradition through much of the 20th century of dry lodges?
Well, yes,
nodding profusely. Yeah.
there are still jurisdictions that are dry, where you're not allowed to have any alcohol in the building. I want to say Texas. I'm talking out my hat, but I know that there are still jurisdictions that are completely dry, and it wouldn't surprise me if Washington had been and went back again.
Okay. I'm just looking at the stuff that's been quoted there from the Washington State Code, and it looks like something that was more recent. That's more recent, and I'm talking, within the last 30 or 35 years, perhaps, where they relaxed maybe previous much tougher rules about alcohol in lodge buildings or near events or something like that.
Yeah. I don't know what the history of it is. It's been as it stands in our code since at least 2013, because that was when they revised the whole book.
Okay.
But beyond that, I'm not sure when it originated. So, Leslie, having been driven to drink by our discussion,
I don't have a whole lot. I don't have a whole lot of questions on the next. I do on the steward for sure, but
all right. Well, I think we've. I'm not even sure what we were discussing there. We were discussing the deacons, I guess, and somehow got onto table lodges and alcohol.
As a good Mason should.
So, with that, I think we're going to wrap up our discussion of today's episode. I think table lodges are pretty cool, and I encourage everyone's lodge to have them. They're fun. But that said, we will continue our discussion of the officers of the lodge next week with our next episode. And on behalf of Stephen and Craig and David and myself, I thank you all for listening to the Working Tools podcast, and we look forward to talking to you again soon. Goodbye.